In a small village far away from the city, there was an old chapel that everyone feared. The chapel had been abandoned for many years, its once grand walls now covered in thick vines, and its windows cracked and dirty. The roof sagged under the weight of time, and the bell tower, once the village's pride, stood silent, its bell long gone. The villagers never went near it, especially after dark. They believed the chapel was cursed, and their fear came from a story that had been told for 30 years, the story of the forgotten bride. Isabella was the daughter of a poor farmer. Her family had always struggled to make ends meet, working tirelessly from dawn to dusk. They lived in a small, run-down cottage on the outskirts of the village, with barely enough food to get by. Isabella grew up dreaming of a better life, filled with love and happiness. But those dreams were shattered when her father arranged for her to marry a rich man from the city, a man she didn't love, a man she barely knew. The marriage wasn't about love. It was about survival. Her father saw the marriage as a way out of poverty, a chance to give his family a better life. But for Isabella, it was a nightmare. The man she was to marry was cold and distant, more interested in showing off his wealth than in getting to know her. He saw her as nothing more than a trophy, a poor girl he could mold into a servant wife. Every day felt like a prison, and her dreams of love and happiness seemed to slip further away with each passing hour. As the wedding day approached, the weight of her situation became unbearable. The night before her wedding, as preparations continued around her, and her father giving orders, Isabella felt suffocated. The walls of her small world were closing on her, and she couldn't see any way out. Desperation gnawed at her heart, and the life that awaited her seemed like a fate worse than death. Unable to bear the thought of living a life without love, Isabella made a heartbreaking decision. She ran away to the only place where she thought she might find peace, the old chapel, where she had often gone as a child to escape the world. It was the only place that seemed to understand her pain, the only place where she could be alone with her thoughts. The villagers found Isabella the next morning. She was in her wedding dress, but she was no longer alive. Her eyes were wide open, filled with fear and sadness, as if she had seen something terrible in her final moments. The dagger lay beside her, its blade stained with her blood. The sight of her lifeless body, so young and full of promise, shocked the villagers to their core. Some people whispered that Isabella's death was her punishment for defying fate, while others believed she had been driven to it by the hopelessness of her situation. But the few who had gone into the chapel after that night claimed they felt a cold, eerie presence, like someone was watching them, making the hair on the back of their necks stand up. As the years passed, the chapel was left to decay. No one wanted to go near it, but the story of the forgotten bride never went away. People said that Isabella's ghost still wandered the chapel at night, wearing her wedding dress, her face hidden beneath a long veil. They warned that anyone who saw her face would never live to tell the tale. One night, a group of travelers got lost in the village. The storm was fierce, and they needed a place to stay. The rain was relentless, soaking them to the bone, and the wind threatened to knock them off their feet. They had heard the villagers talk about the chapel, but they didn't believe in ghosts, so they decided to take shelter there. The chapel was dark and cold when they entered. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. They lit a fire to keep warm, using the old, rotting pews for kindling. But the wind outside was so strong that it made the doors and windows shake. The fire flickered weakly, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The travelers huddled close to the flames, trying to find comfort in the warmth, but the unease was palpable. One of the travelers, a young man named Thomas, began to feel uneasy. He was a skeptic by nature, always seeking logical explanations for everything. But something about the chapel felt off. The air around him felt strange, colder than it should have been, even with the fire burning. The shadows seemed to dance in unnatural ways, stretching and shifting with every flicker of the flames. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something, or someone, standing at the end of the aisle. It was a woman dressed in white, her long wedding gown trailing behind her on the floor. Her face was hidden by a veil, and her hands were clasped in front of her, as if she were praying. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He called out to her, asking who she was, but she didn't answer. The other travelers looked up, their faces filled with confusion and fear. None of them had seen her enter the chapel. Instead, she began to move slowly toward him, her feet barely making a sound on the stone floor. Her movements were graceful, almost ethereal, as if she were floating rather than walking. Thomas felt as though something was pulling him toward her, making it hard for him to breathe. He couldn't look away. As she got closer, he could see the outline of her face beneath the veil, pale and ghostly in the dim light. The other travelers began to panic. They could see the woman now, her figure becoming more distinct with each step. One of them tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The wind outside had grown even stronger, howling like a beast in pain. The fire flickered violently before going out completely, plunging the chapel into darkness. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he should run, but his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The woman was close now, just a few steps away. He could hear the faint rustle of her gown as it brushed against the floor. She reached up and began to lift her veil. The room seemed to grow colder as the veil slowly rose, revealing her face. Thomas saw her eyes first, dark, hollow, filled with an endless sorrow that seemed to reach into his very soul. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with a faint blue tint that made her look more like a corpse than a living person. But it was her expression that terrified him the most. It was the look of someone who had lost everything, who was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. Thomas tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, his mouth frozen in a silent cry of terror. The other travelers watched in horror as the woman reached out to him, her hand cold and lifeless. She touched his face, and in that instant, he felt a wave of despair wash over him, as if every happy memory he had ever known was being drained away. The doors of the chapel slammed shut with a loud bang, trapping them inside. The wind outside howled even louder, and the fire was completely extinguished, leaving them in total darkness. The last thing they heard was a sound that echoed through the chapel like a cry from the depths of despair. It was a sound that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. When the storm finally ended, the villagers went to check on the chapel. The sky was clear now, but the ground was covered in broken branches and debris from the storm. The chapel doors, which had been chained for years, still looked the same, but something felt different. The air around the chapel seemed heavy, as if something terrible had happened. When they managed to open the doors, they found the travelers huddled together in the middle of the chapel. Their faces were pale, and their eyes were wide open with fear. Though they were alive, their bodies felt cold and clammy. The villagers tried to wake them and find out what happened. It took a while for the travelers to start talking. When they did, their stories were shaky and confused. They spoke of a terrifying presence in the chapel, a cold, heavy feeling that made it hard to breathe. They described seeing a ghostly woman in a wedding dress moving towards them slowly. One traveler, Thomas, talked about seeing the ghost's face as she lifted her veil. He said her eyes were full of sadness and fear, and it was so frightening that it left him paralyzed. The villagers listened, growing more frightened as they heard the details. The chapel felt even colder, as if the ghost had left a dark energy behind. They carefully led the travelers out of the chapel, deciding to keep it locked forever to protect others from the curse of the forgotten bride. On stormy nights, when the wind howls through the village, people say you can still hear the cries of the forgotten bride, forever searching for the love she never found.